So I think we need to really emphasize the importance of the early childhood years in a way that modern research has really documented. The central role of the family in producing skills, and also, and this is I would really stress, that we go beyond thinking about test scores, and we go beyond thinking just about achievement score gaps in terms of an achievement test, whether it's SAT, whether it's GRE, whether it's No Child Left Behind, or any other system. I realized that Horace Mann was the Secretary of Education, I think, in Massachusetts, right? And in his role was the one to first introduce the notion of an achievement test, right? Or at least the early version. But I would also point out that Mann in his writings and many other speakers, many other educators since then, people like Ralph Tyler, John Dewey, and so forth, have always emphasized that the role of the school was much more than just producing knowledge. It was also producing character. It was producing what was considered by some moral education back in the 19th century when the school ethos, the educational philosophy was really driven by Protestant Christian notions. Nonetheless, it was considered, even into the, I think, until fairly recently, a central mission of the school was to shape character, to teach children not just to become good citizens, for sure, and to become sort of people included, fully rounded people, not just people who pass a test on one margin or another. So I think we have to really understand, so I'm trying to suggest today that if we think more broadly, we can move the dialogue beyond just racial boundaries. And I think that is essentially going to be something that would be more politically feasible anyway in the current environment, and that we think about using all the resources of the society, including the resources in the private sector, harnessing the love of parents for their children. So let me just briefly talk about the skill gap if I have some time. I'd like to talk a little bit about, make a few points and show a few slides. So I want to summarize a body of evidence that shows that even though discrimination of a first order kind, discrimination was so blatant, so evident in the labor force in the 1960s. I mean, Jim Crow laws. I went into some of these establishments. I was in Birmingham just a few months after this bombing, and I saw, everybody who witnessed that period would know how divided, how segregated, and how much anger and violence there was implicit. And the discrimination was real. It was in the books. You couldn't hire a black man in the South Carolina textile plant. It was the law. But I think we need to understand that right now, that kind of blatant discrimination in payments and skills is less of a problem than the skills themselves. We're talking now in the year 2012. And so I think we really need to reconfigure it. I want to consider the skill gap and how the family plays an important role. And I want to talk about policies that might address it. So when we think about achievement gaps, we think broadly about schooling, huge amount of schooling gaps, test scores for sure, earnings, these social emotional skills, they're all real. So when we think about these test score achievement gaps, we want to think very broadly. But now I want to make another point. So maybe it just, might as well be hung for a sheep as for a lamb. So I'll make a few statements here that maybe incendiary. I want to argue that if we prioritize, remember, I'm a quantitative economist, that overt discrimination in the labor market and college admission is no longer the first order problem in American society. That doesn't mean that civil rights laws should be repealed or enforcement compromised, nor am I denying anything about discrimination. It surely exists and should be eliminated. But I think what we need to understand is that one of Thurgood Marshall's great triumphs was essentially disassembling and breaking down this discriminatory system. What is now the problem is inequality in skills. So I'll show you an example of which there are many in the literature and labor economics and these figures. This is an example from recent American labor market data, looking both at Hispanics and blacks, and looking, for example, at the shortfall. If you look, for example, in the wages, these are the hourly wages for young people in the early 30s, in the U.S. labor market. This is taken around the time of the last decade. And we see real shortfalls. We see that blacks are paid less, 25% less than whites. If we look at Hispanics, 15% less. Females, 17%. It's not as bad, but it's still quite bad. And those things are statistically significant. If we look at Hispanics, we see a 7% shortfall. But if we actually adjust for the abilities that individuals have, that they actually, when they measure with these wages, these gaps, actually in one group, Hispanic males go into surplus, and for all the female groups, they go into surplus, that the gaps in wages are largely responsible due to ability, and this is a measure of cognitive ability. It's skills that matter, and adjusting for them eliminates them. And I will make a comparable figure. If we look, for example, we know there's a huge disparity in black, white, and Hispanic white attendance at colleges. There's no question about it. This is an example, again, from the US data. This is taken back a little bit earlier in the late 1990s, but we get similar figures now. I have a student who basically replicated what I'm about to show you. And what you see is basically a 12-point shortfall. Fewer blacks, 12-point fewer, participation rate in college. This is entering college, whether it's a 4-year college, a 2-year college, big gaps. Now, remember, this is now in the late 1990s. Once we adjust for the ability that children have at the time they enter school, we actually see a surplus, which is statistically significant. And this, I think, is a result of successful affirmative action policies. So what we're saying by these numbers is that blacks holding ability constant are more likely to go to college than whites, Hispanics more likely as well. That, I think, is a stat, and this is true for both men and women, which is cool. So any serious analysis of these disparities has to take into account these notions of ability. Okay, so I'm not arguing that there isn't discrimination. Of course there is. And minorities experience a lot of bigotry, it shouldn't be tolerated. But I think if you look at these first-order problems, we understand what's going on. These gaps in skills are playing a huge role. That's important. And so the question is, where do these skill gaps come from, and what can we do about them? Now, many people say these gaps aren't real. Cultural bias, stereotype threat, parental expectations. I'm sorry, but the evidence is really quite strong that these gaps are there. They're real. But the question is, how do we interpret the gaps, and what can we do about them? And I think that's the important part of it. So let me talk about an aspect of this, which also turns out to be quite important. Character traits. I'll talk very briefly about this. But when we think about character traits, we really need to think more generally. I mean, Woody Allen actually has a great line about the importance of perseverance. He says something like 80% of success is showing up. Edison was famous for his quote that genius was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. We know this as a common sense, but we're not doing it. We're not implementing it. We're not even thinking about schools as being a major producer of these traits for a variety of reasons. I think there are good reasons. Let me just show you some evidence of how powerful these traits are. This isn't just speculation. We can measure these traits. So if you look at one dimension of the groups, if you look, for example, going from the bottom of the distribution to the top of the distribution in both cognitive ability, the cognitive ability is the blue line, the non-cognitive ability, the personality traits are there. We can see that people at the bottom of the distribution of cognitive and non-cognitive, and this is across the board. This isn't just a racial, this is not a statement about blacks or Hispanics or any particular group. It's males, but we find that people high up in the ability distribution are much less likely to go to jail, much less likely to be doing a lot of pathological phenomena. Look at teenage pregnancy. If you go to the top of the distribution, it's almost non-existent. At the bottom of the distribution, 10% of these girls. It's been declining, but it's certainly true. And again, this is across all ethnic groups. These ability factors matter. If we ask who graduates college, we go from the bottom of the distribution. I don't know if you can read this. You go from the bottom of the distribution to the top. People at the top of the distribution of both cognitive disability, cognitive ability components, and non-cognitive components are very likely to graduate 4-year schools. The same thing is true about graduating high school. Who drops out? Those ability traits matter. They matter a great deal. And I mentioned, just for the benefit of the secretary, who mentioned GEDs, and people have mentioned GEDs many times. I think the GED program for me is a very interesting case. It shows the critical role of character in actually explaining and the danger of neglecting it. What is the GED? The GED is this test that some 12 to 13% of all high school dropouts now take to certify that they're the equivalents of high school graduates. Many government programs today are basically still giving the GED and counting it as a mark of success that they get GED certifiers. But what do we know about the GED? Well, at one time, by the way, it's close to 1 out of all 5 high school certificates issued in the United States were the GEDs. But what do we know about GEDs? Here's the distribution of their ability, kind of the familiar bell-shaped curve. And the most interesting part is, well, the GEDs, if you look at the ordinary high school graduates who don't go on to college, these are people who are just, who used to be the traditional middle class in America. The GEDs are very close in terms of their cognitive ability. And this is true for males and also for females. Yet, what's staggering is that the GEDs, smart as they are earning at the rate of dropouts. 40% of GEDs try college, 4% actually succeed. Why is this important? Well, this goes back to the point. If you look at their non-cognitive skills, and this is a summary measure, we have many, many measures. What we find is that GEDs are actually much more like high school dropouts, and in some dimensions even worse. So why do I go on about this? Because this first slide would be considered a triumph by the psychometricians. These are the test scores we're using to monitor the gaps. I remind you that those GEDs are not earning at the rate of high school graduates. They're earning at the rate of dropouts. So you can see if we rely on a test score as a measure of success of schools, our society, we're going to be badly misguided. The GED is just a stark example of that. So let me, and I would point out in the context of the African American case, that counting the GEDs as dropouts, the official statistics showing the improvement of the African American high school graduation rate actually vanishes. We have the same high school graduation rate in 1960 as we do today. No improvement whatsoever. And the apparent improvement in the high school graduation rate has actually been engineered by the fact that the GED was introduced into prisons, and that many GEDs issued are GED issued in prison GEDs, and that accounts for a substantial chunk of this alleged improvement. So that's the first point. I'm going over my time, so I'll try to skip through these slides. But let me talk about something about skills, because skills are a sensitive and important issue. First of all, let me show you something which I think is extremely important. And there are many versions of this graph which I can show you. If you look at these same abilities that I use to predict who went to college, who doesn't go to college, the gaps in wages, look at age 18. That's the gap between a child who has a very highly educated mother and a child who has a less educated mother. High school dropout mother simply is not giving the opportunity, for a number of reasons. I'm not blaming the mother. I'm just saying the resources aren't available. But the most staggering thing about this gap at age 18 is it's more or less there at age 3 before kids enter school. Schools, such as they are in the United States, aren't really changing that gap all that much, one way or the other. And of course, we know that children are living in going to very different quality schools. So again, it's the emphasis that I would make. So let me get to this question of skills, because it gets to what is sometimes considered a hot button issue, but I think shouldn't be. What we've come to understand is that family environments play an important role in shaping skills. The idea that skills, IQ, that all these traits are given to us at birth is simply wrong. They can be shaped. IQ, these character traits. And so the idea that somehow, even though there is aspects of variability and so forth, there are strong bodies of evidence, which I'll just briefly summarize. So the idea that somehow the social Darwinist notion that people are born dumb, or there are certain traits that people are given at birth, and you can't change them, is simply wrong. It's against all the evidence. We can change them, we can change them dramatically. And I'll give you an example in a minute. So the question is, how do we actually foster these skills? Oops. What's the best way to foster skills? I think the best way to foster skills, is it going to be fixing schools? Well, yes, we can't hurt by fixing schools. But I would argue supplementing family resources. Low-performing schools, of course, should be improved. But somehow supplementing parenting resources that essentially are in short supply are really important. Some 50 years ago, about the time that Moynihan was writing, James Coleman, my former colleague at the University of Chicago, was also writing. He wrote what was called the Coleman Report, and he pointed out that most of the variability in performance of children across schools was actually due to families, not due to the quality of schools. There were very sharp differences. The only exception were the very